This morning I'm very aware of our radio audience. There's a number of things we have on our website that can be very helpful to all of us. And some of them have to do with some of the end-of-life medical documents like living wills and medical power of attorney, so you can just go to our website. And also on the back of our insert this morning that is Acts of Love Medical Decisions, there's a website listed about the Conversation Project. And this comes from an article in the Courier by Ellen Goodman, in which she was talking about ways in which families can have end-of-life conversations. And she's put together a whole packet of information. And Ann Shields, who is our web servant here, this will be another thing that she can put up on our website for us. Now, we can make lots of plans around the end of our life, and it's obvious there's a lot of loose ends. When my dad was in the process of dying, I made the startling discovery that not only was I someone who liked to make plans, but my mom, she really liked to make plans. And so every morning when I was down there the week before Dad's passing, she had a whole other list of things that we had to take care of that she had thought of during the night. And that was very helpful. But even my mom, the super planner, could not plan for everything. And so the day of Dad's funeral, which was the second Saturday of February, it was extremely cold, 0 degrees. And we had the graveside service before going to the church for the celebration service. And so the family were getting out of their cars, and Dad's grave plot was like a city block from where we parked the cars. And my wife Marty was helping my mom up the pathway, and my mom exclaimed to Marty, "I told Raleigh not to die in February." So we can't control everything. But I find it fascinating, and particularly in the Gospel of John, the number of times in which Jesus had conversations with his disciples about his impending death. Now sometimes the disciples didn't want to hear anything of it. They said, "No, Jesus, no, you don't have this right. You don't have this right." But as the end approached, they started to take his words more seriously. In the account that Bill read this morning, Jesus is reading their minds and says, "I know that you're talking about my death. I want you to know some things. One is that the pain that you will experience now, over time, that will be touched by joy. You may always have some pain, but more and more joy will transform the pain." And then Jesus stepped into very dangerous territory. He compared his death with a woman giving birth to a child, which I have learned from experience. It's wise for a man never to talk about labor and delivery issues. It's something we know only through observation. But Jesus made the analogy that it's much like a woman who goes through the pain of delivery, of childbirth. But soon after birth of the child, the pain is forgotten. trying to get them ready for his death and also his resurrection. Now, I mentioned earlier about Ellen Goodman, the founder of the Conversation Project, to help families have good death experiences. And I count my dad's death as one of those beautiful experiences in my life. Yeah, there were some ragged edges, but it also gave us a wonderful chance to come together as a family, to love each other, to love Dad. And Ellen Goodman, and with those who work with her on this project, said that there seem to be two elements that go into a good, beautiful death. One is that the loved one has been able to express their wishes. And she says this is best to take place at the kitchen table over many conversations rather than in the intensive care unit. So to have that kind of advanced conversations. I know for me, with my children, those kind of conversations started almost 8 years ago now when I was diagnosed with prostate cancer. And the awareness, I'm a fragile human being. And so we began to have conversations. And that gives them, as I said earlier, the opportunity to just say, Dad, you're nuts. We're not doing that. But I bet they have ice cream. And so having that opportunity to talk beforehand. And then the second element is that the wishes were respected when the time came. Now that sounds easy, to respect the wishes. But having been through this process with many families over the years, every situation is very different. And it's hard to know, is this the moment? Has this been the last medical procedure to try? Or is there still one we should try? It's not always clear. I know the prayer of my family over the last year or so was, Lord, may you make it clear when it's time for Dad to stop dialysis. May you make it clear, or clear enough. Clear enough. But when families are working together, what emerges is a decision that comes out of love. Now it's fascinating in the polls that 70% of people will say during these kitchen table conversations that they want to die at home, or certainly not die at the hospital or in a care facility. But when the time comes, only 30% get to die at home. And it can point to a disconnect. Sometimes there's no other choice because of the great care needs that are there. But it points to a disconnect between the desires of a person and what actually happens. One of the things I love about Jesus and his actions is that he was someone who accepted death as part of the fabric of his existence and his purpose. That the death that was coming was an important part of his act of love on behalf of humankind. And he was trying to get his disciples ready for that. That he wanted them to be able to accept and not fight. In fact, the night that he was arrested in the garden and was taken and imprisoned that led to his crucifixion, one of his disciples drew his sword and wanted one article that I was reading that contained research from the Pew Institute, and this came out in November of 2013, that over the last 23 years in which they've done this same survey, that over that 23-year span, people are twice as likely to keep fighting for their life as they were 23 years ago. So in 1990, 15% said, "I'll fight at all costs." In 2014, "I'll fight at all costs." Now that still leaves way over 60% who are saying, let's see how this progresses. Whether it's wise to keep fighting or whether it's wise to accept and surrender. That's why the conversations are so important in our households. And no matter what age we are, no matter what age, it's okay to talk about these things. And some of you have brothers or sisters or parents. Some of us are the ones who the conversations are about. But they're good conversations for all of us to have. I have 4 sisters. And one of my goals over these last few years was that I wanted all 4 sisters and myself to still be loving and respecting each other after the death of our parents. And so as Dad went through all of his medical trials, there was one sister particularly that I made sure we kept in the loop. She's the one that lives furthest in Maryland, and she is also the most wonderfully soft-hearted person in the family. And so I knew that when it came time for difficult decisions, Sue would have the most struggle because she was so far. It'd be easy for her to feel guilty for not being present. And also because she had such a deep, compassionate heart, it'd be easy for her to come in and say, well, let's keep trying this and this and this and this. But because we had all talked openly and kept Sue in the loop, Sue was able to say things like, oh, I wish we weren't at this point in time, but I understand we're making the right decision. She came along and could be part. And I think, as part of Dad's dying and in the aftermath, my sisters and I have more love for each other now that is evident than in a long time. Because we've worked together, we've talked together, we've laughed together, we've remembered together, we've loved together. Dying is hard, but God is in all things. And so God is willing, as we invite God into the midst of these things, to leave marks of grace and marks of love that will help carry us through. And yea, though we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Jesus was right there with the disciples. God is right there with us. A friend of mine, his mother was in a care facility 2 hours from where he lived. And finally decided it was time for his mom to come closer. And so he found a care facility that was right between his work and his home. And so every morning he could stop in, every evening he could stop in. Made it easy for his wife friends stopped in. And also when his sons would come home, they could spend time with their grandmother, which would light up her face. But as her Alzheimer's got worse and other bodily ailments got worse, she no longer could recognize or enjoy the grandsons or the son. And the staff was good at helping her eat, although she would continually protest, I don't want to eat. I don't want any food. And the staff was good at getting her up to walk, to get out of bed. But every time they did so, she said, this hurts. No, leave me in bed. Finally, one night, my friend was called. She was having a medical emergency, and he took her to the emergency room. And when the emergency room attendants tried to give her an IV, she screamed because of the pain. It was then that my friend thought, you know, it's time I listened to Mom. And he told the emergency room staff, let's not do anymore. He took her back to the care facility, and for each shift of the staff there, he told them, if Mom does not want to eat, don't feed her. And if she doesn't want to get up, if she screams out in pain, please don't get her up. I think what she's saying is I'm ready. And we're just prolonging her pain. Within just a few days, she died in peace. For me, my main counsel for families, for myself, is in making these end-of-life decisions, every family will come to different conclusions. But what's most important is that whatever decisions are made, that they come out of a deep love for God, a deep love for the person who is dying, a deep love for all of the family, of how it's impacting their lives, and a deep love for the extended community, with the caution about running up medical costs that just add to debt. And finally, that we can have confidence that the present moment, no matter how difficult, can be transformed into joy. It was Jesus' promise for his disciples. It's his promise for us. That just as up from the grave Jesus arose, we too pop up into eternal life.
Okay, so ready to get started. I'm Elizabeth Kelly, and as Larry said, both Larrys have said, I am the chaplain at Blanchard Valley Hospital and Bluffton Hospital. And so I've been asked today to talk about advanced directives in Ohio and a little bit about what they are and how they work. Who was here, who was here before? Okay, so some of you, about half of you here before and half not. And so for those of you who are already here, this isn't a canned speech, so I don't say the same thing twice. So if there's something that I said that you thought was really meaningful the first time and I don't say it as we go along, raise your hand and remind me, please. So today we're going to talk a little bit about advanced directives, the basics of the durable power of attorney for health care and living wills and what they do and don't do. Some practical strategies around the conversations that you would want to have with your families, with your doctor, and why you would want to have those. And why it's important to have these directives. There are four, or really 3.5 advanced directives in Ohio. The durable power of attorney for health care, the living will, and those kind of go together. Anatomical donation, whether you would want to be an organ donor. And then the half one, and I call it a half one because technically in Ohio it is not an advanced directive. That is the Ohio do not resuscitate. And while you can choose not to be resuscitated, in Ohio the do not resuscitate order is a physician order and has to be signed by a credentialed physician in practice. So that's a little bit different. So let's talk a little bit about the living will and what it does. The living will allows you to specify the health care you would want to receive if you become terminally ill and or permanently unconscious and unable to make your wishes known. So it's really important to remember that as long as any of us are able to make decisions, to take in sometimes complex information, to seem to understand what it means, and to make decisions about that, we are our own spokespersons, and we make those decisions for ourselves. But sometimes we're not able to do that, and so we need someone else to do that, or we need to give information about how we might want those decisions to be made, and we can't speak to that. So the living will tells your family or friends and the doctors what you would want or not want under those very specific circumstances of being terminally ill and unable to speak for yourself. The durable power of attorney for health care really speaks to the who rather than the what. The living will spoke to the what you would want. The durable power of attorney speaks to the who would you want to make decisions on your behalf if you're not able to do it for yourself. So some of you may be aware that today is the Hancock Handlebars, the big bike club here in Hancock County, their horizontal 100 ride. They've got several rides today. There are a lot of bicyclists out there. And so if one of those bicyclists hits a rock, flips off the bike, breaks his leg or her leg, and has a concussion and can't speak for themselves, it's their durable power of attorney that would let people know who they want to make decisions for them until they're capacitated and able to do that for themselves again. So the durable power of attorney doesn't even require someone to be terminal or at end of life. It could just be that for some reason you're not able to do it at that time. This isn't related to end-of-life care, but a number of years ago I was called to meet with a young couple. She was about 5 months pregnant. She'd had a medical condition that necessitated some surgery that was unrelated to the pregnancy and was kind of complicating her pregnancy. And she had had this surgery, and the father of the baby was there, and they had their license to be married. That was their plan, to be married, and he wanted to get married right then and there, right in the hospital. And so I was asked to come and officiate the wedding. And I'm licensed to do that in Ohio. I'm ordained and I'm certified to officiate weddings. So I talked to them. They were a lovely couple. And I noticed that he was pretty scared. And I noticed that she was on a pain pump because she had just had the surgery. And sometimes when you take pain medications, you don't remember. It kind of blocks out your memory. And so I said to them, this doesn't seem to be a life and death situation. And I realize you have the license, but I really don't think it's the right thing to do to officiate your wedding. And I declined to do that for them. He wasn't very happy, but that was that. 4 months later, she came back into the hospital and delivered a very healthy baby. And I went to see her. And she said, I kind of reminded her who I was. And she said, I want to thank you because I have no memory of just before the surgery until about 3 days later. I have no memory of any conversation I had or anything that happened, and I really would like to be able to remember my wedding. And so thank you for saying no. We weren't happy at the time, I understand that, but thank you for saying no. So there are plenty of times in our health across the continuum of life that we may for a short time be incapacitated, not really able to make important decisions, and somebody may have to step in and do that on our behalf. In her case, she seemed to be making her own decisions, but who knew that she wasn't going to be able to remember what she was talking about? Anatomical gifts or organ donation you may be familiar with when you go to get your license. They ask you if you want to be an organ donor, so there's a registry. But it's also helpful if you've included some of this in your conversations with family and talked about what you would or wouldn't want or what you're comfortable with or not comfortable with, so that at the end of your life, if you're not able to tell them, they're aware of what your goals are around organ donation or your philosophy of care. And again, I'll give you another illustration of a teenager who had been in an accident, had a traumatic brain injury, was not expected to live. And this family was approached for what's called solid organ donation, which would be her internal organs. This was when I was in training in another city. And in reflecting on this request, this young patient's mother said to me, you know, I think it's kind of gross, organ donation, and I would never choose it for myself. But a couple of weeks ago, we were watching a documentary about organ donation and transplantation, and my daughter turned to me and said, you know what, if anything ever happened to me, I think I would want to be an organ donor. And she said, so I want to do this because this is what she just told me she would want, even though probably not what I would choose. So again, it's even those seemingly casual conversations or comments or opportunities for discussion that you may have that you may not even remember or you may not think are that important. Give the people we love important information about who we are, about what we believe, what our values are, and how we would make decisions for ourselves. And then this Ohio Do Not Resuscitate order is a single standardized piece of paper in Ohio. It's called the Ohio Do Not Resuscitate, and it is in fact a physician order signed by a physician. And I'll say just a little bit about it. Typically, 2 categories of people make decisions about being a DNR, a Do Not Resuscitate. And I kind of think about it in terms of categories of people in their life experience. The one category is that people who have an advanced progressive disease or medical condition who may not expect to live much longer and know that they're not going to be cured, or perhaps they're not even, there may not even be any treatment available to them anymore. People that we would think of as being ready to choose hospice care for their end-of-life care. So those persons or their spokespersons might make a decision to be a DNR, so that if their heart stops, or when their heart stops, or they stop breathing, aggressive resuscitative measures aren't taken. Does that make sense? Those are the people who are choosing to have a peaceful death with comfort care only at the end of life. The other category of people who sometimes choose a Do Not Resuscitate are people who are living with a chronic condition that may be progressive over time, even over decades. But they may have advanced in that condition, say a pulmonary condition, so they go from being a little short of breath, taking medication, and they're basically okay, to a point where it's hard to do stairs, to a point where they require oxygen a few hours a day, to a point they require oxygen all the time, but they're still getting around, still enjoying life, still doing things. But as they've gone out here with this condition for some years, and they know that it's not going to get appreciably better, they might say, if my heart stops, or if I stop breathing, please don't resuscitate me to then have to die of a disease that I know is never going to be cured or is only going to get worse. So those people may make a decision a bit earlier. They may be living with a chronic progressive cancer that can be treated over time. Again, they're still functioning and enjoying life, but realize that if it becomes that, if their condition becomes that critical, they don't want to be resuscitated because they'll still have that disease. It will never be changed. And so those are the two groups, typically groups of people who think about being a do not resuscitate and having those orders put in place. The other thing is that the presumption is when we call 911 or when we take someone to the emergency room, that we do everything until we know that the person has made a decision otherwise, or until we know that that everything may or may not be working. So typically, if we err toward a more aggressive care than some folks would have wanted, rather than the belief some people have that they'll do nothing. When advanced directives were first promoted, there was a big fear among physicians and among hospital administrators and nursing home administrators that if someone had a living will, we wouldn't do anything to help them even when we could. And that's not really proven to be the case. And the same with the DNR. You want people to know you have it, and especially if you've made a decision to have it in place. But most likely you may get a bit more care than you intend until it's clear to the physicians that are treating you that these are your wishes and it's appropriate to honor those wishes. So let's go and let's talk about the durable power of attorney for health care a little bit, because this one is so important because it's about the who. Who speaks for you if you can't speak for yourself? And something I didn't say in the previous session that I wanted to clarify. The durable power of attorney for health care is just about medical decision making. It's not paying your bills, writing your checks, or making financial or business decisions on your behalf. That is just the kind of generic durable power of attorney, and those, it's unfortunate that the terms are the same because that really confuses people. And so sometimes people choose someone to serve in both capacities. Sometimes people divvy up the responsibilities. And so in my mother's case, one of my sisters makes her health care decisions. She's assisted by my brother, the veterinarian, because he has the medical knowledge, according to my mother. And although he's not a good decision maker, but that's her choice. And my other sister takes care of her business and financial affairs. So, she kind of shared the wealth. I am the outlier daughter who lives far away, and I'm the one who swoops in to create trouble or solve problems, something like that. So there are a variety of ways to do it. But it's so important that you choose someone that you feel like you can trust, and who you can trust to make the decisions the way you would make them for yourself. And so another illustration of this is that I was working with an adult woman who was making decisions on behalf of her mother. Her mother was unresponsive, on a ventilator, and not expected to survive. And her mother had created advanced directives and named this daughter as her spokesperson. And the daughter turned to me during our conversation and said, I don't agree with what she's decided. She left her instructions, but I don't really, if it were me, I would choose something different. And I don't particularly like what she's decided. But she chose me amongst my siblings because I'm the one she trusts to follow her instructions. And so I am going to follow her instructions, even though It's not what I would choose for myself, and it's not really, if I had my druthers, what I would even choose for her at this time. And so that woman had been very wise in selecting the person that she thought could carry out those instructions. This may not be the person who's closest, it may not be the eldest, it may not be the smartest, but you know who those people are in your lives. The other thing about the durable power of attorney for health care is that once that person is chosen, they can use other people to inform them, help inform them around decision making. It's not just that person. So they become the point person and the spokesperson. But in the case of the patient we had who had 11 children, you know, the spokesperson could get consensus among the family members. Kind of like Larry described in your sermon this morning, how your family, it was important to your family as you made decisions along the way, or helped your mother make decisions on behalf of your father, that your end goal was still to be in a meaningful relationship at the end of the day. And which isn't easy in some families. And so being able to talk to one another and keep each other in the loop and share information, and that doesn't mean that everybody gets their way, or that it's not difficult at times, but what it means is that when things are said and done, people have a better idea about how the decisions were made and what decision was made and for what reason, and what the goals are. Again, the durable power of attorney is particularly powerful because it can work in a very temporary circumstance that's not related to life or death. And it can also work in a more serious or critical circumstance when there are more critical decisions to be made. I think I've covered all this. And in Ohio, there's a pecking order in the Ohio Revised Code. And so if you don't have any documents, people sometimes ask me, what if I don't have a document? Well, no. Well, if you don't have a document, by law, if you're an adult, if you're a child, it's a parent, makes decisions for you, or a guardian, if for some reason a guardian has been named. But by law, it would be your spouse, if that person is able to do that or even exists. Adult children, and your siblings, your parents, and sometimes we have people who come to the hospital who have literally no family. They came from a small family and they've outlived everyone. And so sometimes we have to go to probate court and ask for a guardian to be named to make decisions on behalf of that person. That's rare, but we're finding actually it's kind of happening more and more, and I think it's because in general we tend to have smaller families, people are living longer, and so anybody here listen to Prairie Home Companion, Garrison Keillor? Okay. Every now and then I think of them as the Norwegian bachelor farmers. I don't know, they're like the German farmers, fall, you know, and they come in and they are clearly at end of life, took care of their parents until their parents died, took care of their grandparents, never married, never had children, and usually some nice couple from down the road comes in and says, you know, this is Harry, and we promised our parents when they were dying that we would take care of Harry until he dies because our families have known each other. And so they're often caring people from the community, but they have no formal relationship necessarily. So if Harry had named somebody as a spokesperson, it would be a little bit simpler and easier for everyone. I personally believe that everyone age 18 or older should have a durable power of attorney for health care. Most likely, young people are most likely to be in accidents. And again, it doesn't mean that they may die, but they may have some serious injuries and need someone to make decisions on their behalf temporarily. And it's that, I mean, if they're 16, it's a slam dunk, it's the parents. But you know, when they're 25 or 30 and they haven't gotten married and their parents are divorced and haven't spoken to each other in 20 years, it can be very difficult for people to come together in those circumstances and try to coalesce to make decisions. I had a college classmate who was an orphan. So she actually had 2 college classmates. And so they really didn't have biological relatives, no siblings, to make those decisions. And so they were often thinking about these kinds of things and how they were going to work out the business of just their personal business as well as decision making along the way. The other thing I haven't said, the durable power of attorney tells your doctor who to talk to. I'm going to cut to the chase. Who's the point person? But often we're treated by physicians who don't know us well. And so the people who love us and care for us and have known us all their lives or our lives are the people who have the most important information to give. And that's why we kind of need to know who they are, and the doctors need to know who they're talking to. I've left some packets here for you, and they're linked to your church website. But there's a blank area in the durable power of attorney for healthcare, and you can add instructions, and you can add pages of instructions. So as I said earlier, the longest advance directive I ever saw was 8 pages, single space, small font. He was a retired physician, and he tried to think of every possibility and gave clear instructions to his family. And they were gracious and followed those instructions too. So you can add on, but there are phrases that are really important that aren't just about do this, don't do that, but say things like, I trust that you will take the best medical advice possible and work together to make decisions. And so often people who have families, members that don't always get along, or maybe they're in a second or third marriage and they're adult children, and it's kind of a hodgepodge of people who are weighing in, you know, making it clear, I want you to work together in this. Or if something happens to me like happened to this person, this is what I would want or not want. Or it's okay to give me 5 days, 2 weeks, some time on a ventilator and to try things, but if in some, a reasonable period of time, that's not working, and the physicians tell you it's not working, it's okay to stop. Because one of the most difficult and painful and morally distressing situations for families to be in is when we never talked about it and we don't really know what she would want, and now we're facing really grueling decisions about whether to stop treatment or stop a ventilator or some other aggressive care or not. So do you all remember high school math, extrapolate, the term, being able to extrapolate? So just having some information to work with and having had some conversations, even in a circumstance no one anticipated, allows your family to extrapolate about what you would probably decide or not choose in the current circumstance. I want to talk briefly about the living will. The history lesson I gave in the previous session was toward the beginning, so I'll regroup here a minute. In our lifetime, if a physician, when I was born in the 1950s, and so if a physician said, "What do you want me to do for your mother?" the answer was, "Doc, everything. Do everything." And that was the right answer at the time. Because in fact, there was so little that could be done back then compared to what we can do now, that just trying was really, really important. Well, technology changed, and CPR, chest compressions especially, and ventilation or helping somebody breathe, had been invented and developed for use in the operating room. So back when anesthesia was a bit more primitive than it is today, if somebody got a little too much anesthesia, they were a 45-year-old guy who went in for a gallbladder operation and oops, got a little too much anesthesia and his heart stopped on the operating table, they could do CPR and revive that person, who would go on and recover and go back to work in a few months. And so it was so successful in the operating room that it leaked out into the recovery room, and it was so successful in the recovery room it leaked out into hospitals. And so whenever someone was in the hospital then, now we're in the 60s and 70s, someone's in the hospital and their heart stops or they stop breathing, a code team would rush in and start to resuscitate them. Well, there were families who were distressed by this, who said, this was my elderly grandmother, and we knew she was dying, and she knew she was dying, and she was at peace, and she was ready to go be with my grandfather, and we were all surrounding her, and as soon as her heart stopped, a bunch of people, strangers, ran in and started CPR, and it didn't seem very respectful or dignified, because it really didn't change the outcome. And so there was a grassroots movement along with the emerging hospice movement in Great Britain and the United States for people to choose what care they would want under those circumstances. And that's where advance directives came from. And physicians and hospital administrators were horrified by this because the fear was that people would just not get treatment that they really needed and that they would benefit from. And so in 1991, there were a couple of lines put in a much longer bill that had, I forget even, it related to agriculture or something. I mean, it really didn't even seem pertinent. And it was called the Patient Self-Determination Act. And that Patient Self-Determination Act said if someone has advance directives, they will be honored. The hospital or a nursing facility or a care facility has to honor those directives if someone has them. And it didn't seem like a big deal because hardly anybody had them. But that was the directive. But there was no information about how that was to be implemented or how it would work in the big scheme of things. And so every state and every institution developed their own laws and then procedures and policies around that. And so that's why when you go into a hospital or a nursing facility, one of the first questions you're asked, do you have advance directives? Because if you do, as an institution, we're supposed to follow them. Now, there's been no coherent plan for storing these advance directives. At Blanchard Valley Hospital, we will file them and scan them into your medical record. And then if you update them, we'll just scan in the new ones so we can see that that's the most recent document. Other hospitals ask that you bring them every time you come. So there are people who carry them around in their purse or their glove compartment so they have them available. But the reason you're asked is because of the Patient Self-Determination Act of 1991, which said, we want to follow your instructions as best we can, but we have to first ask whether you have those instructions or not. And so the whole process for using advance directives is still evolving in that regard. The living will is what you get to use, the mechanism you use, for saying what you would want under particular circumstances. And under Ohio's restrictions, where Ohio has pretty restrictive laws around the living will, you should have been in the hospital for 48 hours or more, certified by 2 physicians to be in a terminal condition and in a permanent, irreversible, unconscious state. Now, you don't have to have much imagination to know that these are pretty tight requirements, and you've probably already had a lot of heroic treatment before you can meet all these criteria. Or that there are people who die. My stepfather was one of them, who was conscious and aware and alert, knew all of us up until moments before he actually died. And so he had a terminal condition, and we knew that, and we knew that the treatment was not working and that he was dying, but he never met that criteria for being in a permanently unconscious state until maybe minutes before he actually died, half an hour or so. So people die in a variety of ways, and this really gives instructions for when you are at end of life and you're not going to regain both the capacity or ever be able to recover from your condition. So it's more the what and how you would want your family and physicians to approach that time. So can you see that it's not quite as flexible as the durable power of attorney for health care? Does that make sense? Because that can work for you even if it's not life and death. And the living will really only works at end of life. Let's stop here for a second. Any questions so far? Did anybody hear anything in the first session that I had said by this point that I haven't mentioned? Were you paying attention?
Yeah, I think you covered it well. You're covering it well.
Okay. Yes.
Donation, at what age would you say that, what would be the point to donate
Yes.
any of your
Okay.
organs? I mean, is there some
So-
kind of a suggested time frame?
Okay, the question is what age for organ donation? And so let me talk about donation a little bit. There's sort of two kinds of donation. One is what I referred to earlier as solid organ donation, which is your heart, lungs, internal organs. And that's typically the best candidates for making those donations are typically younger, healthier people. There's not a particular cutoff because you can have a young person who's not very healthy and you can have an older person who's incredibly healthy. So we're typically younger, healthier people who still have some miles on their organs and who've had a neurological trauma so that they're being kept alive by a ventilator that's breathing for them, which allows their heart to continue working, so that those organs could be donated while they're still getting blood, and it's called perfusion, and they're still working well. So the teenager I spoke of earlier, she had just a terrible brain trauma, but otherwise was extremely healthy. And so she was an excellent candidate. She was on, they'd attempted resuscitation. And so she was an excellent candidate for donation. Those people are actually becoming fewer and fewer because more people are surviving. The other kind of donation is eyes, skin, bone, and that upper limit is a bit higher, but tissue, and you don't have to have been on a ventilator and had all that perfusion to be a candidate. So what I would say is if that's important to you, make those wishes known. And there's an evaluation and assessment process that happens when anyone dies. In Ohio, when someone dies of any cause, within an hour, a call is made to our regional tissue service, or Life, it's called Life Connection here. And the information about the death is provided to them, and they'll say, oh, thank you, but really he's too old to fit our criteria, or the disease was such that that wouldn't fit our criteria, or yes, that person actually would fit our criteria. And sometimes we're surprised. Not only that, more and more people are donating their bodies to medical science. for use in medical schools as cadavers. And the oldest patient I ever had who had made a donation to a medical school was 100. Now the medical schools provide the transportation. I mean, they pay for the transportation from the place of death to the medical school. And she had done that in another state about 30 years before. And so they declined to accept her. But I'm sure it was in part because the transportation logistics were going to be more than they really wanted to deal with. But she had that card, and her daughter knew she had that card, and she was ready to do it. So there's the other piece of donation that factors in. So if you want to donate, check that box, check what you would be willing to give, and they'll figure it out after the fact. Any other questions?
We were talking in the first session as you travel.
Oh, good point. Okay, about travel. When advance directive laws were made across the United States, states had different laws. Some states didn't have any, some did. Before the Patient Self-Determination Act became enforced. And so some states would not honor other state advance directives from other states. That has all changed. And so if you're traveling, and this is important to you, you take those papers and something happens to you in another state, those institutions really do work hard to honor the intent of your documents. So they may have to follow their law. So in Ohio, we have to, for a living will to be invoked, 2 physicians have to have determined you're in a terminal condition. In some other state, it might only be 1 physician. So we would follow Ohio law, but we would follow the intent of the directives. And those directives, because I've been in situations, can be extremely, extremely helpful, both to families who are trying to come from a distance and this was not expected, and physicians who are not familiar with this person. An example I gave, there was also a question in the first session about international travel. My sister-in-law's father-in-law was from Japan, and in that culture, they typically don't talk openly about their medical conditions. He had a serious progressive disease, and he came here to the United States, was going to be here for a while, and brought a piece of paper from his physician. It had the physician's name and contact information, had some basic information about his medical condition, and said, should something happen to Mr. Koga while he was here in the United States, you know, please call and he would help work with doctors here. So there's that kind of intermediate thing that's not a legal document, but he didn't need a legal document. He had his family, just needed some critical connector information if he needed it. So did that cover most of that?
Yes, and I think I was talking to you afterwards about having a little business card in my wallet. So I got some basic information there of contacts.
Right.
Contacts.
The other thing I haven't said yet is when you do these directives, you make some copies. You don't stick them in your safe deposit box and hide the key. And so you make copies and make sure the people that you've named in those directives or your other children, everybody gets a copy, your physician. You might even have one in a convenient location and file them at the hospital. And again, if you redo them and update them, which is important to do periodically, then you want to know who you sent the copies to, send them out again, and make sure they're refreshed. I recommend that they are reviewed once a year, because sometimes we aren't really thinking too much about it and our circumstances change, our health changes, or our family dynamics change. And so you just want to review them and make sure that the information is still correct, or it still meets your goals of care or philosophy of care in your situation. Anything else, Rick? Yeah? So I've talked about the living will. Big thing that is really most important is that you have a conversation. was doing the documents. And a lot of people go to their attorney's office and do them because they're private people. And they do these documents and then they don't tell anybody, or they don't have nuanced conversations about how they would or wouldn't think about different circumstances that might occur in their lives. And so the more you can have these conversations, even informally, as Larry said, around the kitchen table, the better people can extrapolate when they need to about what you might choose. And they are difficult conversations to have. I don't think I said that in the first session. But these are sometimes painful conversations. When I was in training many years ago, there was a lovely patient, and she was at end of life. We were talking, and she looked at me and she said, "I know I'm dying, but my family just won't talk about it." And a day or so later, I encountered some people in the waiting area, and I was sitting with them and I was listening to them, and they were talking about their loved one who was in the hospital. I didn't know who that was. And at some point they said just enough that it dawned on me, oh, it was the same woman I was just talking to yesterday. And before I could complete that thought in my head, the daughter looks at me and she goes, "We know she's dying, but she just won't talk about it." And I've come to think of that as sort of the conversation gridlock. Everybody thinks nobody else is talking about it, you know, but the conversations are hard to have. And so I coached that. I never said, "Oh, I met your mother," you know, I think she would talk about it. I just said, "You know, I bet if you said, 'We really love you, and we understand that right now you're really sick, and they're not going to be able to cure you. Let's talk about this.'" I said, "I bet she might be willing to have that conversation." And in fact, they did. And so just kind of steeling ourselves and saying, this is going to be tough to talk about, but let's do it. And there may be tears. There may be some cross words, because it brings up memories of how other people in the family died, or things we might not be happy about that happened in the past, or things that feel unresolved. But it's okay to transition through those moments, so we can really be honest with one another and share what's meaningful in our belief system and value system around these kinds of decisions.
And we do have some packets up on the table that help you with those kind of conversations around the table.
So I think this is a good time to wrap up. Are there any other questions? Anything I left out?
Very well.